are, in a sense, standing on the shoulders of giants, because there was an extraordinary emigration here in the 1930s. It's a good story on both sides, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, I've chosen as my title Einstein and Bartok, but in both cases, I'm afraid I am sailing close to the wind as far as historical accuracy is concerned. It is true that in 1932 or 33, Albert Einstein did accept the job in Istanbul as professor of, I think, theoretical physics. And there was a sort of vin d'honneur to welcome him. And then the then Minister of Education, Rashid Ghalib, said in French, "Now, Professor, I wonder, could you tell us what time of the week would it suit you to give your seminar?" And Einstein said, "I'm not teaching." So he wasn't in the end appointed and went to Princeton instead. Bartok is another matter. You will have noticed the Adnan Saygun Music Center that we have. Now, Adnan Saygun, the subject of a recent biography by Emre Aracı, is a most remarkable man who was inspired by Western music at a time when you wouldn't ordinarily hear it, although he did come from Izmir. And he wrote an article somewhere in 1935 suggesting that Turkish music had some sort of counterpart in Central Europe. And Bartok in Budapest read the article and invited himself and said he would like to know more. Now, Bartok had gone round the Transylvanian countryside, listening to the Romanians making their music, and really trying to prove that they were really Hungarians. It's nationalist stuff of that era, 1910 or something. So he was interested, and he arrived with a recording machine this size. And Adnan Saygun and he got on very well. In fact, he came to Turkey 12 times, so did Hindemith. They got on very well, and Saygun took him into the Anatolian countryside in some huge Hispano-Suiza with this vast box. And they would arrive in some Yeşil yurt or other and would invite the peasants to make their music. Now, the peasants, if they saw a Westerner arriving with a huge machine, assumed it would be some kind of Greek trying to blow them up. So they fled into the forests until Saygun said to them, "Now look, the Hungarians are a sort of Turk, and to prove it, Professor Bartok will say a few words in his language." And Bartok would come out with words like barley, arpa, apple, elma, tent, chador, and whatnot. And the peasants would make their music. Curiously enough, I picked up Bartok's recordings of Anatolian music in Vienna. 3 CDs, which I bought. Do you know, I'm very fond of this country, but I have to say that the Anatolian peasant music sounded like an army of vacuum cleaners having a nervous breakdown. There was a German musicologist who turned up, and I was able to say to her, with an air of great mansuetude, "Here is a very valuable present for your collection." So I haven't listened to them again. Bartok did, curiously enough, apply for Turkish citizenship. Something went wrong, I'm not sure what, and he went to New York instead, where he died in about 42 or 43. Now, these are my headlines, as it were, and if you'll forgive me for introducing the subject with that. But the point is that the emigration of the 30s into Turkey was an extraordinarily rich one of, well, pretty well any field that you can think of. There are not just musicians. Let's take the architects. If you go round old Ankara, you sometimes see very distinguished buildings, for instance the Sumer Bank in Ulus Meydanı, which was put up by a German architect called Martin Wagner, who seems to have been a most appalling pain in the neck. Even if you go around Bahçelievler, which is where they tended to concentrate in those days, you can see quite good examples of late 20s, early 30s architecture. Probably the most famous of these architects who came here was Bruno Toth. He was a Bauhaus man. He'd put up modernizing 20s buildings in Weimar, Germany. Then he went to Russia, put up some things there's a famous tower in Moscow. Then when Stalin turned neoclassicist, he went to Japan. And then Japan went fascist as well. So poor old Toth had nothing to do, and he wrote to Martin Wagner to say, could he be saved by the Turks? And the Turks said yes. And Bruno Toth arrived here, and he did put up one quite striking building, which is by the first bridge in Istanbul, on the European side. And it's a house in the Japanese style, which is quite a distinguished little piece of work. However, poor old Toth, he wasn't lucky. In November 1938, Ataturk died. And Toth was very moved. He wanted to thank the great man for what he had done. So he wrote a letter to the Minister of Culture, I think it was Necdet Tur, wasn't it? Met him? Can't remember. To say, could he design the tomb of Ataturk, and he wouldn't charge any money. Now, he is a Bauhaus architect. He is very moved. He built a tomb that resembled a sort of golden egg box. And the Turks said, we can't have our great man buried in this monstrosity. But how do they say no to Bruno Toth? A dilemma. And Toth did I suppose, the only generous thing he ever did in his life. You know what he did? He died. And he's buried in it himself, in Edirne for some reason. Now, the supporting cast of characters like that, it goes on and on and on of extraordinarily distinguished people. Hans Reichenbach, for instance, who was originally a mathematician, but who wandered off into psychology, into the psychology of science. You know, when mathematicians and theoretical physicists get together, you get, as a result, the atom bomb done with squiggles on the back of an envelope. Reichenbach is of that class, and he was also the leader of the Turkish skiing team. It's people of this class that we're dealing with. There was Fritz Naimark, whose memoirs are a wonderful classic, which it has been translated into Turkish. It's called Zuflucht am Bosporus, Refuge on the Bosphorus. Naimark is an extraordinary, generous-minded and elegant writer. He was professor of financial accounting in Istanbul, was still quite young, arrived in Turkey. He describes it. Your boat comes round the Saray Point. You look at this extraordinary Istanbul skyline. You arrive, you stay in the Park Hotel, which, if you know the Istanbul skyline, there is now one of the worst monstrosities in modern Turkey, which is a ghastly concrete car park just next to the old German embassy on the skyline. They should blow it up. That replaced the old Park Hotel, which was the posh one where everybody stayed. And he was invited to a reception by Ataturk the next day. He had to go from the pier in Karaköy to an Armenian tailor who got him a proper suit done in 6 hours or something of that sort, met Ataturk, and Ataturk, he describes Ataturk, these extraordinary blue eyes. Ataturk had that amazing leadership quality. You meet him for 5 minutes, you never forget it. And Naimark was like that. A lot of them were. Now, he sat down and he thought he must make a go of his time in Turkey. So he sits down methodically and learns the language. And within a year, is actually sitting on the Educational Reform Committee. Can you imagine something like that? He wasn't alone. There was a lawyer, Ernst Hirsch, to whom I'll return, whose Turkish was so good within 6 months or something that they actually put him on the Language Reform Committee. There's another. While I'm on the... Look, I hope you'll forgive me. My talk has no structure at all. There's another one. Probably the most extraordinary of them all was a man called Ernst Reuter. Now, Reuter, his moment in history was when he was Lord Mayor of Berlin at the time of the blockade that Stalin imposed in 1948. He would have succeeded he would have been Willy Brandt if he hadn't died relatively early in 1953. Now, he spent his time in Ankara in the 1930s and 40s as professor, I think, of town planning, something of that sort. And he was, curiously enough, my introduction to this whole subject, because when I first came here, I would meet old ladies who would say, who would say in French, "Vous avez connu Reuter?" And I would say, "Tell me more." And they would redden slightly. And because Reuter, when he was professor of town planning here, was a terrible, terrible womanizer. He couldn't stop. He used to get around Ankara on a fast bike with his beret on and chase around. You can imagine the circumstances from one house in Barchelevner to another. And everybody had their Reuter story. But he went back to Berlin in 47, late 46, became Lord Mayor of Berlin, and is one of, if you like, the early heroes of the Cold War. His origins, well, 20th century. He was a working class lad, had been captured on the Eastern Front in 1915, was imprisoned in Kazakhstan, good linguist, picked up Kazakh a bit, then went back to Germany, fought in the Red Army, went back to Germany as a communist, member of the Reichstag, decided he didn't like the communists, became a social democrat, was Lord Mayor of Magdeburg, was chased after by Hitler, was put in Buchenwald, let out, put back in again, and was got out by the English Quakers, and got a job on that network as professor of town planning in Ankara. Now, old Reuter, young Reuter, seems to have learned Turkish in the train, because when he arrived at Sirkeci station, he too was a member of the Language Reform Commission. And you can imagine the scene where the dignified members of that Language Reform Commission will be trying to think, is there a Turkic word for a toothbrush? And it would turn out, Professor Reuter, what is the Uzbek for a toothbrush? And he would supply it. That was his, and it wasn't just him, by the way, there were others. Now, I've given you, I hope, enough of an idea of the quality of people involved. I could spell it out. Well, let me give you another one. The first one, in the end, is the first one to get here of that sort, although there are differences, was a man called Helmut Reuter. Now, he had attended the Orient Institute in Hamburg when it was set up in 1910 or 11. He came to Turkey in the First World War as interpreter and, I suppose, intelligence for the Germans. Then he went back to the Orient Institute in 1919, where he had the patronage of a very remarkable German called Karl Becker, who was the Prussian Minister of Education. Now, in 1926, in somewhat mysterious circumstances, he had to leave Hamburg. The rumor I've heard is that it was because of homosexuality. Now, all I can say about that is that if somebody is expelled from Hamburg in 1926 for homosexuality, it must have been very bad. he appeared in Istanbul with no money. Jeffrey Lewis told me he was a horrible man. Lonely, twisted, bitter, cold, mean, all that sort of thing. But he kept himself going as member of a string quartet because he was a brilliant cellist. Now, he was also a quite outstanding Orientalist. I looked up some of the articles he wrote on the sort of subject which I would not have a hope of understanding, of writing about. which is Sufi mysticism. He knew his Old Persian, he knew his Arabic, he knew his Turkish, everything. And there he is. And he also had a sort of cataloguer's mind. So when the time came in 1932, when they needed a cataloguer for the library of Istanbul University, they chose Helmut Reuter. And it was characteristic of the background to the arrival of these emigrants that Reuter should have been chosen, because the library catalogue in Istanbul University at that time consisted of a little old man writing things down in Ottoman on bits of paper and putting them into a drawer. That was the library catalogue of what was called the House of Wisdom, the Darul Funun. And they moved Reuter in to do the cataloguing of the library, where he made himself very unpopular. In the event when it was possible to get rid of him, they pushed him out in 47 or 48. But he came back in 1956 with German government patronage, and I think died in Turkey, if I'm not wrong. But that was the first one. Now, the background to all of this, what is it? I said when I started that there is a big, well, there's always been some sort of Western presence in Turkey. It grew in the later 19th century with things like the Galatasaray Lycée, other institutions, Robert College. And then in 1908, after the Young Turk Revolution, there is a quite systematic attempt to think out what needs to be done to set Turkey up as a nation state in the rubble of the collapsing Ottoman Empire. And the Young Turks weren't lucky, because as soon as they proclaimed their revolution, they didn't get a chance to put anything into effect. But they did say to the Germans during the war, can you send us some experts? And the Germans did. There was a physicist called Ernst, who came not just in 1918, but subsequently in 1934 as well. Now, then comes the Great Reform period in the 20s, and I think, looking back on it, it is... now, I know this is a subject which divides the Turks very badly indeed. But it seems to me that the language reform, the alphabet reform, was the decisive step in 1928. A lot of things got lost by it, but a lot of things got gained by it, not least near universal literacy. If in this country 11,000 books get translated every year, whereas in Egypt it's 300, that gives you a measure of the difference. And, but still, people in the older University of Istanbul, the House of Wisdom, didn't like this. They said, you know, it's destroying whole acres of the national past. It's a very dangerous thing to do, and they resisted it. Now, they were also not terribly good at running a university, so the then educational establishment, Reşit Galip, Hasan Ali Yücel, who wanted the modernization, wanted to get rid of the university. They commissioned a report on it, and the report said what everybody would say about universities that are in bad conditions, and it was closed down. Very few of the old academics actually survived, and some went into exile. Now then, what happens next? 30th of January, 1933, Hitler. And Hitler said, by the beginning of April, we want Jews out of academic life, and started making life difficult or impossible. So there is a field of talent open for, quite providentially, for the Turks to use. And they had a very good contact through the army in the First World War, who was a doctor working in Switzerland called Schwarz. And he was very helpful, and he advertised throughout Germany, there are places opening up in Turkey. So people arrive. Now, the curious thing is, it is not just Jews. There was the Germans, as you can imagine, are quite keen on this subject, and there are some very, very good books on it, some of which are upstairs. There's a very distinguished one by a man called Horst Widmann. And the Germans have produced a catalogue which is this. It's got a title in, of all things, Yiddish. I mean, it is a very good catalogue, and it was a very good exhibition. But in what possible sense can you say that people like Hans Reichenbach, or Ernst Hirsch, or Fritz Naimark, or Albert Einstein have anything at all in common with a Yiddish Heimatlos? It's ridiculous. Still, a good catalogue. But who are they? These Germans who arrive. In total, it comes to, I think, about 1,000. Some stayed, some only stayed a year or two. If they could go to the States in 1941, when Germany looked like winning the war, then quite a lot of them went. There are one or two rather sad cases of wives who couldn't take it. There was a very sympathetic man called Gottfried Kessler, who was the first professor of sociology in Ankara. And he arrived with his wife and 4 children, 2 girls, 2 boys. He too had been in Buchenwald, and the Turks had got him directly out of it. When his wife arrived here, she couldn't take it, and she and the 2 daughters left him in the middle of the night, and the 2 boys refused to go and stayed on. There are sad stories of this sort, but it is still something like 1,000 in the main of the cream of Germany, and to some extent Austria, and even to a minor extent Hungary, coming here in that period. Now, it's an interesting thing. I said, that giving this catalogue a Yiddish title is an insult. It's an insult to the incredibly cultivated people who came here. If they want to spend their Saturday nights, they set up a musical party with them all playing an instrument or singing or something of that sort. But quite a lot of them are not Jews at all. Quite a number had arrived because they had Jewish wives and refused to divorce them, as the Nazis insisted. And quite a number were just ordinary people, not even of the left, who simply couldn't take the Nazis at all. A sizable chunk of the German Democratic Party people who had set up the Weimar Republic in 1919, quite a sizable little chunk of them arrived. There is, for instance, Wilhelm Röpke, who was really, in many ways, the author of the German economic miracle. If you want to know why England, between 1945 and the early 1980s, went down and Germany went up, read Röpke. He says the entire story. Very, very good man was Röpke. There is Alexander Rustow, who had been the secretary in Berlin of the Small Employers Federation, and who said, look, this world in which you have big monopolies and fly-by-night banks, no, not for us. And he resisted that. There was a man called Bada, who was a stalwart of the FDP in Germany. No, he joined the Christian Democrats after the war, who was an expert in agriculture and who was responsible, of all things, for setting up the Ataturk Schriftlich here. It was Bada. Now, these people go back to Germany in 1947, whether it's Ernst Reuter or Bada or whoever, and they say, how do you set up a state? How do you devise a constitution? And they had their experiences of Turkey behind them, which has never been written about. Rustow did write about it, and so did Röpke. And they sit down and they write what I think is the best constitution that anybody's ever done, which is the German Basic Law of 1949. It's very short as these things go, at least in the original version, which is how constitutions ought to be. The longer the constitution, the less its life, in my opinion. And what they learned from Turkey is quite an interesting subject. Now, There's another aspect of this which has not been written about. But before I get on to this, by the way, no, subject I'll keep for the end. It's an important one. I don't think I've ever seen, and perhaps it couldn't be done, any account of the influence of these people on Turkey. I mean, I have heard innumerable times from their students, and sometimes from the students of their students, what an impact they had. It's particularly true of Ernst Hirsch, the lawyer, but the medics also left an incredible stamp. And they were very good people who would spend their weekends volunteering to go out into the countryside and tell the peasants about elementary hygiene. It's a very uplifting story, the medical side. But I think there are certain general things that one can maybe conclude from all of this. I think the first thing to be said about it is that the Turks handled these foreigners very astutely indeed. They knew that it wasn't going to be easy for them, that, for instance, the language would be a problem. And they made things, on the whole, quite easy. Whether it's Hassan Ali Yücel in the Ministry of Education, he used to have there weren't very many places to meet in Ankara in those days, but there was a famous cafe in Tandoğan where Hassan Ali Yücel used to hold court with whoever wanted to go and talk to him. He was a translator of literature himself in his own right. The salaries, it has to be said, were more than generous. The foreign professors were paid more than a deputy or even a judge. They were very much looked up to in those days. I mean, if you were a professor, you counted as among the highest of the land. And when Ataturk died, the cohort of professors followed the cohort of generals in the procession. I don't know where we'd be now, but they were given that kind of respect. Life, as you know, in Turkey for a foreigner it's fun. Interesting things happen. People are helpful. They have a sense of humour. All this kind of thing. It's picturesque if you're stuck. All of that, I think, says very good things about how the Turkish state handled them. It of course included the rectors of the new universities who understood. And it's at this point I might bring in Ernst Hirsch, because he had been a lecturer in jurisprudence in Berlin and came to Istanbul as jurisprudence, had a slightly difficult time establishing himself, learnt Turkish quite quickly, and was chosen to give the inaugural lecture of the university in 1936 when they showed it off to foreigners. And he chose what must be a very interesting subject, which is how you translate the law of one country into the practice of another. At the time, the Republicans were trying to modernize, well, replace the old law. So they chose the Swiss law for this, the Italian law for that, German property law, apparently, which now exists in an unmodernized form. This kind of thing. Now, Hirsch was capable of talking generally about this subject to a large official audience. And he talked about the difficulties. He knew his Swiss law, his Italian law. Everybody sitting listening like that. And then at the end of it, in the last 5 minutes, he says, but it would be helpful if you were translating the law of one country into the practice of another, if you do accurate translation. Now, unfortunately, we have translated these laws inaccurately. And he went through the Italian, the German, the French, sat down. Who had done the translation? The rector. I think it's characteristic of that time that the rector would not have put him on a train and sent him back to Buchenwald. In fact, he did. He went back in 1946, 47 to set up the Free University in Berlin, which was set up when the communists took over the old Humboldt, and was rector there, rather unfortunately, in, I think, 1968, but a great man just the same and not forgotten. There's another point in all of this, which I know we're in an English language university, which has been very successful, and perhaps I shouldn't say this, but it was a condition for these foreigners then that they should teach in Turkish within 5 years. And I sometimes wonder if, somebody should not have put the boot under me when I first came here. I have made an effort with Turkish, I have to say. It's a very difficult language, but perhaps if we had intensive training for Turkish, for people coming here to teach, it's not a bad idea. The drawback, of course, is that some people can do it and other people can't. There is it this side of the brain for words, and this side for figures. And somebody like poor old Rupke, architect of the Wirtschaftswunder after the war, came and he knew about this line in his contract. He must learn Turkish and teach in Turkish in 5 years. And there are some people who just cannot do it. The same was true of von Mises, the brother of the famous economist, who was also teaching here. They wrestled with Turkish, they wrestled with Turkish, and they wrestled with Turkish, and it was no good. And so eventually, before they were, they found themselves, in both cases, I think, jobs in Switzerland, and then went on to the States. But the others managed to make that adaptation, and they also fulfilled an interesting contract, a bit of the contract, which was they were required to write textbooks in their subjects, and they did. I haven't read them, to my shame, but there they are. If you want to read town planning and whatnot, there is Reuter, sociology, there is Kessler. Now, as time went by, of course, the Second World War ended. Unfortunately, Turkey then went into a difficult time. I mean, that wonderful feeling of the new horizon of the Republican period tended rather to dissipate. At the end of the war, there was quite a lot of starvation. There was terrible inflation. It became a bit difficult for the foreigners to survive. And there was also something coming up, which I can fully understand, which is a bit of a nationalist backlash. Why are these people here? Why? Now, I even get that nowadays if I talk to Mete Tuncay, a distinguished left-wing historian in Istanbul. He says, what would it have been like for you if you'd had your best academics sacked and replaced by a lot of emigrants? And I said, well, look, the answer to that is Einstein, isn't it? And the answer is also Istanbul University, which at that time must have been the best university in the world. So, but it is obviously a sensitive area, and there was a bit of a nationalist backlash, which I think in some ways some of them felt. So they start going in the later 1940s. I will end with this one. They retained vast loyalty to Turkey and went on being helpful in the case of Dankwart Rusto in the States, remarkably so. Fritz Naimark, very, very helpful to the Turks in Germany when they started coming in the 60s. And in the case of Gottfried Kessler, whose marriage had broken up, he went back to be rector of Hamburg University. And do you know what? He didn't like it. Didn't like the weather in the Baltic. Didn't like the way they talked in Plattdeutsch. Didn't like the food. Didn't much like the music that he heard. So he wanted to go back to Turkey. And in 1958, a new university was set up with American money, the Ataturk University in Erzurum. And he applied for it, and he got it. He came back as deputy rector. And there was a ceremony, which was attended by Celal Bayar, Menderes, all the establishment, for the opening of the university. And there were, champagne flowed, tears rolled down cheeks, national anthems struck up, more tears down cheeks, bunches of flowers. Kessler made his speech saying he was duly grateful for this wonderful renaissance that had occurred in his private life. And you know what? They cut his salary in half. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. Please don't suggest to the rector that we have to teach in Turkish. So that doesn't go beyond this door, okay? We have just under 10 minutes for questions. We are due to finish at 1:30. So if anyone would have a quick question or two for Norman, he's willing to answer them.
I have a question. When Turkey received all these refugees, did it cause any diplomatic tensions with the Nazis, or were they actually very happy to see them go?
That's a very good subject. There were terrible tensions. It's in the very early stages. A lot of the official Germans were desperately embarrassed by it, as you can imagine, and were actually extremely helpful. And in the early phases, they sent their children to the Deutsche Schule. And although I don't think they had nothing to do officially with the Germans, when von Papen came as German ambassador, and he was a very, very clever, slippery man who took out a sort of insurance for his own, which paid off, because he was quite helpful under the counter to people like Reuter. For instance, he would renew their passports and be quite helpful in that sort of thing. So when they put him on trial in Nuremberg in 1946, 45-46, there are people who are prepared to stand up in the witness box and say that he'd been helpful. So Papen, I think he was acquitted, actually. No, he wasn't. No, he was acquitted, but then he was put in prison by a German court, but was let out relatively early in 52. But it's true. And of course there are endless rumors of spies and counter-spies, and Istanbul was full of espionage at that time. So the doings of these Germans, life wasn't that comfortable for them. You know, they had to register with the police if they went from Ankara to Istanbul, all this kind of thing. So it's a good question, that. Helmut Reuter was on the guest list of the German embassy in 1943. I've seen the invitation. This funny old thing being wheeled out. Right.
You mentioned briefly the impact on Turkey, and that perhaps no books were written, or there's no feedback to say. The impact left by these professors in Turkey. Do you know of anyone who's written any books on their impact? Because it's hearsay. I've heard some friends talk about the German professors, how good they were. But is there nothing which reflects the Turkish influence?
I know of nothing except, but I have been told there have been quite a lot of newspaper articles, but I don't know if anybody's ever taken that together in any sort of, in any book form. I mean, it'd be a terribly difficult thing to do. Starting off with Anit Kabir. I think the original designer of that was German, but then it was moved on to a pupil of his. What was he called? Thanks. I think he was a pupil of one of the Germans, and it was he who won the competition in the end. It'd be terribly difficult to talk about the influence of, say the medics on. I'm just thinking how you do that. I am actually thinking of doing a book myself on the Western Europeans in Turkey since the Tanzimat, because it's a very interesting subject of how the two sides got on, but actually how to structure a book like that, and over so many different things is. I can see why it wouldn't be easy. All you could do is do what I've done, which is relapse into anecdotes, for which apology.
Here's it.
Yes.
Do we have any further questions? John?
I'm interested in this issue issue of the late 1940s, why these people left here, whereas, let's say, in the United States, they stayed, they didn't go back to Germany. I'm wondering if, I don't know if this is true or not, the Turkish academic system at the time was so hierarchical, like the German, with one professor per subject, and that these positions were occupied by these immigrants. And so the younger Turkish scholars could see that they would never get to that position themselves. And so then from jealousy, they led a revolt to kick them out. Is that true?
Well, I think part of it is simply real circumstances. You know, the inflation at the end of the war hit them very, very badly. So they were living quite, for Ernst Reuter to stay when he could get a job back in American occupation in Germany would have involved a certain economic sacrifice. I think that is an important side of it. But I don't have any direct evidence about the as it were, the backlash. Ilber Orteiler said to me, but I pass it on, that in Ankara University they got a dean who not only didn't like the foreigners, but wanted actively to get rid of any sign of the Ottoman past. And he said he did an awful lot of damage to the Ankara University Library because he just got rid of the Ottoman things altogether and made life a bit difficult for the foreigners as well. Now, I simply don't know. I pass it on for what it's worth. Some of them did stay, but it would be, for instance, I didn't talk about the theatre, but one of the people here was Praetorius, who had been the what you call it, intendant of the theatre in Weimar, and he was helpful in setting up the whole theatrical world in Ankara, and his wife stayed on. Like an idiot. I missed meeting her. She died not long after I got here, but I could have met the old bird. And I think there were, I have heard that some of them did stay on in one form or another, but obviously in the high profile jobs for whatever reason, no. It's a good subject.
Well, it looks like Norman should be fun.
Norman, going back to the earlier issue, when I was attending Istanbul University in the late 1950s and early 1960s, professors there were always making references to the works of these journalists. And in their publications also, not only in their lectures, but also in their publications,
Yeah.
they were making references to the books these people wrote, either in their own language or in Turkish. So someone may go out and look at these references.
Yes.
Both in a quantitative sense and also on what topics
Yes.
they made references to these people. So that might give us an
Yeah.
idea of at least some of the impact these people had.
That's true. That's true. There is, there's a new book. It's upstairs by a man called Reisman, which has made an attempt at doing this, but it's not very well crafted. The book, and I don't think his German is up to it.
But on the medical side, actually many stayed in Istanbul University.
Did they?
Yes, of course. When I was a student there, I haven't seen any of them, but the generation that was brought up by those professors were the professors there. And I remember Max Clara in histology, Winterstein in physiology, Frank in surgery, and Reinman in experimental medicine. These all stayed until 60s or even 70s and remained in the departments.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, as I was going to say, it looks like Norman's got his research for the next few years sorted out. Plenty of things. Thank you again, Norman, for a very interesting and enjoyable talk. A couple of things before I finish. Firstly, I'd like to thank some of the library staff who do most of the work to arrange this. Ulku, Tijen, Tamses and Tarek work very hard to make sure things go successfully. And secondly, I invite you all to come here again in 4 weeks' time, Wednesday the 5th of November. We shall have a talk by Dr. Emre Özgen, the Chair of Psychology. I heard him speak 2 years ago at the Philosophy Day, and I know it will certainly be both interesting and very enjoyable. So I'd love to see you all then in 4 weeks' time. Thank you again. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. That was a great way to start this. Would you like a cup of tea? I've got to be at the history department at 2, but we've got time for it. Yeah, okay. Let's see what's there. Did you must have known it.
Are in a